My name is Ernest Lee, and thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mrs. Kim. I'm going to be talking about Korean Friendship Bell, which is in San Pedro. And in the process, I will talk about the history and the relationship between the United States and Korea. I will try to get in as much detail as I can. So without further ado, we are going to be covering the following items: the purpose and historical background of the bell, and the historical events and connections that led us to the presentation of the bell, and certain embedded culture and symbolism that are presented in the bell itself. And there are some that are hidden, and you will get a benefit of that insight. Having gone through this presentation, you will know something that other people don't, obviously. And then there are certain things that we're planning to do in the future, and hopefully we'll have enough time for question and answers when we're done. So here's the Bell of Friendship, more commonly known as the Korean Friendship Bell. And it's kind of an interesting statement in itself. When the bell was presented, it was presented as the Bell of Friendship, mirroring that of the Statue of Liberty. Now, because it was a bicentennial gift from the Republic of Korea to the people of the United States. And the grand thinkers that the Korea had gathered to discuss what to present to the people of the United States, they were aware that it was probably going to be very difficult to match the grandeur of the colossal statue, that is the Statue of Liberty, presented to the US from the people of France for America's centennial. And since this was a bicentennial, they looked deep and hard into their history and tried to find something that would be as meaningful and as enduring for the people on both coasts. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. So here is the Bell of Friendship. It is a 18-ton bell, almost 10 feet in height. And it is, even to this day, one of the largest bells ever cast in the world. And certainly the largest bell for a long time. There are now about 3 other bells that are cast slightly bigger in Korea. Namely the Korean Peace Bell, which is located in the DMZ between the North and South Korea. And it was erected in the 2000s, and it was just barely a ton over this one. But when this bell was presented, it was certainly one of the largest that had ever existed in Korean history. So as I have mentioned, it is a bicentennial gift to the people of the United States. And when they talked about how far back they had to go, they went back about 1,000 years, because this original bell, the Divine Bell of King Seongdeok, was from the Unified Shilla period, which was around 771 AD. And again, the largest bell in the world in 1976, 12 feet in height, 7.5 feet in diameter, 18 tons, and made mostly of bronze alloy. And at that time, cost about $500,000 to cast. And it took 9 bell masters and 12,000 laborers. Now, that sounds like an exaggeration in today's standards, but if you're looking back into 1976, Korea was still a developing country, and they didn't have the benefits of the advanced hydraulics or the heavy equipment that would make the work of carrying over 18 tons of the molten metal a breeze. They actually did it with pulleys and carts, and the 12,000, most of the laborers were actually military personnel conscripted for the purpose of forging this bell. The reason that they had to have 9 bell masters, as you can imagine, it had been 1,000 years since anybody had tried to cast a bell this large. And Korea had just come out of 35 years of colonial rule, which was quite brutal. And in fact, most of the church bells were either taken or stolen or molten for various war efforts by the colonial government of Japan. And the surviving 9 bell masters who knew how to do this had really never forged anything this big, but they put their heads together and figured out how to do it. And it took them 2 tries to get this right. And the pavilion itself was constructed over 10 months, and they had to fly in 30 artisans from Korea. And they were stonemasons and carpenters and metal workers and such. And they actually stayed at the site, and because the site itself was the former site of Fort MacArthur, and they had old barracks that they could use. And it cost additional about $450,000. And much of the stonework that is there today was actually cast right there. And in fact, many of the locals have broken pieces when they would make a mistake. They would throw it away in a big pile, and people would sneak in the middle of the night, and they would take the sculpted pieces and put them in their garden. So I think one day it'll be an interesting tour to plan if we could find all the pieces that are strewn about in San Pedro. Interesting tidbit, it was first designed and set to be presented for the bicentennial. But when the bell was first cast, it developed a crack on the first try. So they had to rush and reforge it. And so barely able to make it to the port of Tucson on the 4th of July. They rang it, then put it on a boat, and it traveled for 2 months across the Pacific. And it landed in San Pedro and then carried over and installed. And on October 3rd, 1976, the bell was rung for the first time in the United States. And interestingly enough, October 3rd is actually a national holiday in Korea, also known as the National Founding Day, Gaechonjeol. And in a historic first, it was designated as a Los Angeles Historic Cultural Monument, number 187, only 2 years after it was presented. Next slide, please. And I think if you could press the play button. Didn't work?
Sorry, is this supposed to be like a bell sound? I clicked it, it didn't work. Let me try again.
Okay.
Sorry, I don't think it's working. I'll be also sharing the link to the slide.
Okay.
So maybe viewers can access
All
from
right.
there.
Sure. So I hope maybe it's just the size of the file. And we were able to dig up some old footages of the first day of ringing, both in Busan and in Los Angeles. And it will actually show in all of its reality, the Korean Friendship Bell, quite naked and just a straight white building with a bronze bell, and the mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, along with the Korean cultural minister, ringing the bell. And of course, in Busan, it was the foreign minister, Kim Sung-jin, along with the ambassador to, U.S. ambassador to Korea, Ambassador Schneider. They were on hand to ring the bell before it was put on a boat. So why was the bell given? First, it meant to commemorate the American bicentennial in 1976, America's 200th birthday. An interesting story here, why it ended up here in LA as opposed to somewhere else. Because it was actually suggested by prominent Korean Americans who had visited Korea a few years back. They were honoring a Korean patriot and a famous spiritual leader, as well as an independence movement leader, Dosanan Chang-ho. And he had passed during the imprisonment while Japan occupied Korea. But his children were quite famous. In fact, his oldest, as you may know him as, was a famous actor in Hollywood, Philip Ahn. He was actually the first child born of the couple in the United States. And he went on to become quite a career in the film. And I don't know if anybody remember or watching the old TV series called Kung Fu. And you may recall there's a young boy named Grasshopper. There are two teachers, and one was the grandmaster who was blind, and then the other one was always the one that giving him a important lesson, and that was Mr. Philippon. And he and his children, his sister and nephews, visited Korea and mentioned that, hey, American bicentennial is coming up. It would be nice if the Koreans did something to show their support. The president of Korea at the time thought it was a great idea, and he put the committee together, and they jumped into action. And within a few months, they came up with an idea to present this bell that would be cast. And one of the things that it was supposed to do is not only does it show the symbol of friendship and alliance, it would also honor the veterans of Korean War. As you can imagine, June 25th, and I think that's one of the reasons why we have this seminar when we do, is around the time when Korean War began in June 25th, 1950. And the Americans actually at that time lost about 36,591, and I think there are about 700 that are still missing in action. I think eventually we will find them and return them home. But you know, on the Korean side, there are several 100,000 soldiers lost their lives, and not to mention close to 2 million civilians who died during the war. And that was something that the Koreans really wanted to honor, because they came very close to losing everything. It would have been a communist Korea, and we would be in a very different situation today. And it meant to honor the shared sacrifice and values. And actually etched onto the bell are these three values: freedom, democracy, and the pioneering spirit, which led to prosperity. And we will talk a little bit about how that is such a significant choice that they had made during that time. Next slide, please. So historical events and connections. When the US and Korea opened a diplomatic relationship formally, it was in 1892. Of course, they were aware of each other, and Korea had was actually existing as a kingdom known as Joseon. And it would eventually go through a effort to modernize, and then it became briefly what they called Empire of Daehan, which exists today as Korea's formal name today is Daehanminguk, the Grand Republic of Korea. So 1892, opening of formal diplomatic relationship. And then Japan comes and annexes quite by force the Korean people. They became a colonial overseer after winning their war against China and Russia, and with the blessings of the Americans, just annex Korea. However, during the World War II, the Koreans used the US as one of their main bases to fight for their independence and regain their liberation. And it was actually the World War II when it ended in August 15, 1945, with the unconditional surrender of Japan, that Korea was able to regain its independence, and it became liberated. So it was not to be too long, because US government, along with the other allies, decided to divide up Korea to disarm the Japanese along Korean Peninsula and on the 38th parallel. And the north became occupied by the Soviets and the south by the US. And it was an occupation by the military government and with the civilian administration. And in 1948, South Korea decided to become its own republic, and through its constitution and election. And North Korea did the same, except it became what we call the People's Republic of Korea, and they were obviously communists. A few years later, with the help of the Soviets, the Koreans war began with the North Korea invading the South on the morning of June 25th. And the South was caught off guard. In fact, the US forces were literally conducting what's called police action, and very little armor or heavy weapons were present. So within a few weeks, most of the ground was lost. In fact, the Korean forces and the US forces had to retreat to a small area in the southeast corner of Korean Peninsula, south of Nakdong River. And that there it drew the defense line until Marshal Douglas MacArthur on September of that year attempted something that was completely brave and many thought insane. Landed the troops in Incheon, cut the Korean peninsula in half, and cut off the North Korean supply line, began to liberate Korea. And they thought they were actually beginning to win the war because they pushed the North Koreans all the way back to Yalu River. But that was not to be, because on the 4th of January, the following year, the Chinese Red Army intervened, armed with very little other than sticks and gongs, but just waves and waves of people. In fact, the US armed forces that retreated, remember, they had to retreat not because they were losing, but because they were running out of bullets and their machine guns were melting. So violent war and a stalemate ensued in 1953 on July 27th. The Korean War came to a cessation of hostilities, also known as armistice. And so because it's technically not a peace treaty, the war has not ended. And it is, in fact, 73rd year that we are in a state of war in Korean Peninsula, and is probably the longest running war in modern history, and certainly in the US. But here's the other fact. By the time in 1976, the US had asked for Korean help in fighting against communism. And the South Koreans were only too happy to join in a way, because they felt like they owed a debt to the US. And also they were allies in fight against communism. And so many Koreans went to Vietnam and lost their lives. They fought bravely, but again, they shed blood together in defense of what they believed was freedom and democracy. And again, that relationship grew into what we know today as modern alliance and partnership. So an official alliance agreement signed in 1953. So this year actually is very significant because it's the 70th anniversary. And the partnership is broad and wide because it encompassed not only education and industrial assistance, but also business models and technology transfers. And it is one of the most important partnerships both countries share today. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about embedded culture and symbolism, and why do we ring the bell, and why is the bell ringing significant? The original bell, the divine bell of King Seongdeok, was cast in 771 AD, and it was actually a brilliant period in Korea. As a matter of fact, a Nobel-winning poet and a philosopher from India named Tagore had written about Korea during this period in Chilla, and he talked about it as the shining light of the East, because it was actually both the center of trade and international exchange and cooperation, and it sort of put Korean Peninsula on the map. And quite an important period and an amazing renaissance of sorts under this new unified kingdom period. They knew already, though, somehow the technology to cast a bell that's 18 tons large. I mean, it is a very massive bell. I mean, imagine how difficult it was in 1976. Go back 1,000 years and it would have been so much more of a task. But it's amazing how much information that we're able to gather from the design that went into this, which is the bell itself, when you strike it, actually creates not only the original cacophony of frequencies, but it resonates and harmonizes, and it creates something called harmonics, where it is designed to open up all of your energy centers. Some people know it as chakras. And by doing so, when you hear this bell, it was something of a prayer, a meditation, and a call to peace, that those who listen to the bell could be could come with a sense of peace and harmony and healing. And so it's quite remarkable during that time when most people were too busy toiling to eke out a living, so much so that they probably didn't have time to learn complex ancient scriptures or scripts. But still, when you rang this bell, you could invite everybody, no matter how high or low, how poor or how rich. When you heard this bell, you were called to a prayer, you were called to a gathering. It's a remarkable act of mercy and beneficence. The bell itself, even though its size and shape is dictated by the divine bell of King Sangdak, it's predominantly Buddhist in its symbolism. But they knew that they were presenting this to the American people, which believes in separation of church and state, and they wanted to make it as civilian, if you will, all the symbolism that would adorn the bell. So instead of the traditional lotuses, they have roses of Sharon, mugunghwa, which is the national flower of Korea. The bell itself has 4 pairs of figurines. One is a goddess Liberty, as you know, it's the Statue of Liberty that you know and love. And then it's holding hands with the Korean female figure. People say, "Oh, that looks like somebody I saw on TV, Korean drama." Actually, they represent Korean Sanya, or the Korean idea of an angel. And again, that means that we have 4 angels guarding this bell in the city of Los Angeles, the city of angels. How appropriate. And they're all actually holding a different, each one is holding a different symbol. One is holding taeguk, some people know it as yin and yang, meaning balance and harmony. Mugunghwa, as you know, is the rose of Sharon, a national flower. Laurel for victory, and the dove for peace. A very symbolic item. Am I speaking too fast? Is everybody able to follow? I guess that's a yes. So here's an example of what that figurine looks like. It's a relief, the Statue of Liberty on one side, and the angel Korean Sanya on the other side. They're floating on a cloud under a shining California sun. Well, actually, not the sun. And all the roses of Sharon. Can we go to the next slide, please? So here's the scientific aspect of this, and all the decoration above and around the pavilion are called tancheong, and they are traditional way of decorating a court or temple buildings. And it's most distinct in that this is actually a court building. It's a palatial design. They modified the lotuses actually and replaced them with hibiscus syriacus or mugunghwa. And that's actually the lattice work that's designed with a specific function, which is that there's a blowhole at the top of the bell. When you strike it, some of the fragmented waves would travel and scatter and dissipate on these lattice work. And the remaining frequencies would travel downward and it would actually intermix and create something called pulsation, or what we know as magnorum. which is actually a unique feature of Korean bell. When you strike it, it starts to resonate and it reverberates, and then it resonates in a different frequency, known as harmonics. And you can actually make it last as long as about 10 to 15 minutes each ring. We obviously cut that much shorter during the ceremony because otherwise we would be there all day. Because we try to ring it 33 times. And I will tell you why number 33 is both auspicious and significant in Korean culture. Next slide, please. So here's an aerial view of what the Korean friendship bell looks like. You might notice how stark it looks because this was actually during the height of the California drought. Right now it's completely covered with Spanish mustard. So the hillsides were yellow up until about 2 weeks ago. What I'm trying to point out, though, is that the Korean friendship bell itself is on a square-looking structure supported by 12 columns, each column representing a directional zodiac animal. That's a whole mythology on its own. But it's actually placed on what's supposed to be an octagonal base. Now, that's kind of important because if you multiply 4 times 8, what is that? Any math teachers in the room? Does anybody want to venture to guess? 4 times 8 is 32. That's right. So 4 times 8 actually represents all directions outward in Asian symbolism. So north, south, east, and west, and all the subdivisions in between, you get 32. But nothing would be complete unless you come full circle back to the center. That would represent a true omnipresence or universality. So that's why I ring it 33 times. And so you may have heard through one of the other lectures how the Korean Liberation Movement, or the Independence Movement Day of March 1st, they declared Korea's independence from colonial rule because they cited American idea of self-determination. And during that time, you know how the American Constitution, or actually the American Declaration of Independence, had multiple signatories. Korean Declaration of Independence was signed by none other than 33 individuals, because the very first sentence of the Korean Declaration of Independence is, today we announce in all directions our intent to be an independent state. So 33. And that's why we ring it, because we want to push the good waves, the good vibration in all directions to everyone who can hear it. Next slide, please. So it is a sacred musical instrument. And again, the symbolism is that it talks about the unified kingdom of Korea and Korea's desire to be unified. Because if you think about the historical unfairness of it, it was actually Japan that started the war in Asia. And it was Japan that was defeated. So why was Korea split in half as an aftermath of World War II? I mean, the Korea should be kept whole, and Japan should have been split in half, while the North and the Soviets and the U.S. Divided up. No, but Korea was way too important geopolitically because it is the gateway to the continent, and then from the opposite side, an entryway to the Pacific. So neither side wanted to let that go and wholly in control of the other. And so they divided it up. Sadly, and Korea has stayed divided ever since, and in a state of war. But here's actually something that's kind of mind-boggling in a way. When Korean government sent out a group of envoys to seek out a appropriate location for this bell, Los Angeles gave them a couple of options. One was at the top of the Griffith park near the observatory because they said, you could see all of LA from the coast to the valley from that amazing view. Would that be great? They said, wow, this is wonderful. And then someone suggested, hey, but there's that little piece of land that we're getting from the federal government. Maybe you should go take a look at it before anybody else does. They came down to its current location, and the guide who said, well, so what was this place called? They said, oh, it's Fort MacArthur. Come again? It's Fort MacArthur. And who's that? By any chance is related to the great General Douglas MacArthur, the hero of the Korean War. They said, as a matter of fact, it happens to be his father that we're honoring at this fort. And so they realized, hey, this was a fate. Somehow this was a destined place to be. Because one of the most important tenets and cultural values of Korea is hyo, which is filial obligations or filial duties to their parents and respect for elders. And what better way to honor the victory in World War II and the Korean War than to place this monument at a former site of a fort that honors his father. Full circle, 33 rings. Amazing. Next slide, please. So when we came on the scene, and it took us a long time, obviously, 2006 to 2014, but we were able to raise enough funds and get the Korean government to pick up the slack and able to restore the bell to its original glory. If you had seen the video earlier, you would have noticed that the bell itself was actually originally presented as a just flat white building because they thought Americans would have too difficult a time maintaining it. They were right, but in 1982, when one of the presidents in Korea visited, and he had no idea how much work and discussions had gone into the place of giving this bell. Looked at it and said, it looks a little naked. Why don't we decorate it up a little? So for the centennial of the diplomatic relations between US and Korea in 1982, they decorated the bell with the tanchang that you saw earlier today. And actually everybody who's seen it said they can't imagine it otherwise. They can't imagine it going back to the naked white building that they once were. So if you could play this video, it'll talk a little bit about that. Well, okay, none of the videos are playing. What do you know? Well, that was a Voice of America reporting our efforts, rededicating the bell. And here's an actual moving piece that we could probably get out of that video. And that is when we tried to restore this bell, we were stuck because A, it had been 1,000 years since anybody cast a bell that large. But two, no one here in the US knew how to A, maintain the bell or restore it, or do the work that required to restore all the tanchang decorations and the structural work that needed to be done. And we looked long and hard. It took us several years until one of our members actually came upon an old Buddhist magazine, like a 10-year-old magazine that had already gone out of print. But in it was a small business card size ad with a phone number. And it said, the makers of the Korean Friendship Bell in Los Angeles. So we called that number. An answering machine came on, called it again, left another message. No one called back. Not next week, not next month. Until about a year later, one of the pupils that had come in to the last surviving bellmaster, one of the 9, had decided to check a message on an old answering machine that they had left behind and found our message and decided, hey, well, let's give it a try and if the phone still works. Um, and there the connection was made, and we paid for him to fly out and give us an estimate. We put a proposal together and we started to raise funds. So here's the kind of the moving part I was talking about, that moving as in like it moves you spiritually, just like the MacArthur connection, serendipity. Um, his teacher for years had referred to the Korean bell as a child that he had given up for adoption as a child. Was always wondering whether it was being fed well or is being educated or being well taken care of. And apparently he had a chance about 20 years before then to come take a look at it. And it was actually in a pretty decent shape, but he was still worried because it was beginning to show signs of age. And it kept talking to his pupils about, well, when you get a chance, go down there and see how it's doing, see if you could help. So when we connected, he just jumped at it. So it doesn't matter whether we make money or not. This was something our teacher has always said to us. So Master Che is the last surviving pupil. Bell Master's head student took up the slack and headed up the efforts to restore and redecorate the bell. And after about 8 months of work, the bell was represented in January of 2014, and that's what the video would have shown. So here's what we're trying to do here. We are trying to further maintain and restore, because it's like owning a house. It's somehow the work is never done. And as a matter of fact, just last week, we had to go and replace the totems that we had placed because the storm had damaged its base. And of course, the tourists being tourists, they decided to shake it until it fell. And we were very fortunate that we were able to salvage it and restore it and put it back in its place. And it's back to business for 4th of July. And we will continue to do our work. And one of the things we are actually going to be launching here shortly, and if you're interested, we would love to share more information, and I will share my email and phone number at the end of this presentation. You can reach out to me. We are going to try to restore it yet one more time. This time, the restoration actually covers the roof tiles as well as the pathways and some of the design elements that were presented but never actualized. So we will revise and implement the 1976 master plan, never completed. Then we're adding to it a walk of remembrance, and this will honor not only the 36,591 war dead and another 700 or so missing in action, but because the Korean War has been ongoing for 73 years, we will remember anybody that's ever served in the armed forces and defense of Korea, that they will have a chance to put their name and their years of service in this pathway to peace. We will add a few more points of interest. In fact, the original plan called for several other structures, viewing platforms, and we will make certain enhancements, one of which is that we are going to hide some outdoor speakers throughout the site so that throughout the day, at a random, a voice will come on and read a poetry or play a flute music. And you will be wondering, where is this coming from? But all of it will be designed to evoke a sense of peace and calm and perhaps a call to prayer. And hopefully we can work with Mrs. Kim here to expand our educational program, not only to include the teachers. And this is actually very, very important because we're teaching folks, we're not catching fish, but we're teaching folks how to catch fish because we are the teachers of teachers. And but we also want to educate the young children to come and volunteer and get some hands-on work and maybe even learn how to do the decorations and artworks and creation, as well as some historical background So I'm really excited to get that going, and looking forward to talking to you about that.